Georgia and Broadwell of SUNY Albany some aspects of verbal morphology in Timucua and the Gulf languages. And are there, with the handouts out in the...
There were handouts on the table, and I also put some right in the now, if anyone doesn't have.
If anyone doesn't have a handout, I'll put up your hand and I'll bring you one.
Okay, so Timucua is an extinct language. It was spoken in Florida, and its affiliations with other Native American languages are uncertain. No one has ever been able to definitely prove a relation to any other language. There's actually quite a lot of documentary material on this language because Timucua was spoken in the Spanish colonial area. Spanish authorities translated a fair amount of mostly religious material into Timucua. So, for example, there's a catechism, there's a doctrina, a confessional, there's a Latinate sort of grammar in the language. And as a sometime project over the last few years, I've been looking at materials in Timucua, trying to understand a little bit about how the syntax of this morphology and the syntax of this language work. Okay. So today I'm going to look at just one thing. I'm going to look at a suffix ta, ta, that shows up on verbs. And I'm going to first try to describe how this suffix works, what the morphosyntax of this is like in Timucua, and then I'll end by comparing it to some things that are found in Muskegean and argue that there's some interesting similarities between this aspect of Timucua morphosyntax and Muskegean. Okay, so moving to part 2 on the handout, there's this very frequent suffix ta, ta, which serves to link two clauses together. So you have first one clause, then you have ta, then a second clause. And looking at the corpus of data, I've identified the properties in A through E. So the verb of clause 1 is not marked for person or tense, and the person marking of clause 2 is interpreted, and I should also say the tense marking of clause 2 is interpreted as applying to clause 1 as well. Point D, ta links either two main verbs or a sequence of main verbs followed by certain auxiliaries. C, the two clauses have the same subject. D, when followed by certain auxiliaries inflected for second person, the suffix is te rather than ta. And finally, the verb of clause 1 often shows a truncated form where some final vowel has been deleted. So what I'll do is I'll show you various Timucua examples that illustrate these general points. So if you look at page 2 in the handout, first I want to illustrate this point that in general, that it, in fact, quite regularly, the verb that has the ta suffix doesn't have any person or tense marking, but it seems to get the interpretation of some following verb. So let's look at example number 1. Nobody knows exactly how Timucua might be pronounced because it's extinct, but presumably it's something like biro leque uqua ta pueno ni kala. Okay, and this is translated, by the way, the material is all Timucua in Spanish, and I've given English translations here. So this means I bring mails. Literally it seems to mean I take mails and come. And notice that the idea of bring is expressed through two verbs, take and come. Come is itself not inflected, but the person marking shows up on this auxiliary ka, ca, which follows the verb come. So the I part is interpreted as applying to both come and take here. There's also a suffix la at the end of the auxiliary, which is some sort of affirmative or evidential marker, which is extremely frequent in first-person sentences. Okay. Example 2 shows some more examples of this ta. Look, for example, we've got actually four instances of ta in number 2. So this sentence means something like, thinking, if I catch fish and place the first one, I will increase the number of fish I catch. Did you do so? Okay. And let's look at the last instance of ta, which is on this word man. Manta kosobi cho. which seems to mean something like, did you do so? Literally means something like thinking a certain thing, did you do a certain thing? And here we have the past tense and the second person interpreted as applying to both the main verb do and the subordinated verb think. Example number 2 also gives you more examples of person marking inflection on auxiliary. So if you look at the first line of this example, this is the part that means something like, if I place fish, something like yukui sota nikwa. The ni is the first person there. It appears actually on this qua thing, which shows auxiliary-like behavior. Okay. So there are more examples here that you can peruse at your leisure, or if you have insomnia tonight. Okay. Now, moving on to the point about where ta appears, I want to. We've just seen some cases where ta links to main verbs. So, for example, take and come, meaning to bring. It also seems to show up fairly frequently before certain kinds of auxiliaries. And I explored some of these patterns in an earlier paper on inTimucua in 1996. If you look at page 3, I have some examples of various auxiliaries where we have a main verb followed by ta, then we have some auxiliary usually inflected for the subject. So in number 5, we have something that means if I serve the Lord God, and we've got a verb meaning serve followed by this ta suffix, then me inflected on the auxiliary qua, which means if. Okay. Number 6 shows a similar example with an auxiliary he, which seems to mean something like do, perhaps. It's not obvious exactly what this means, but this sentence means, did you pray over the first corn? And the relevant part is ituhu suta hebi cho, where ituhu suta is something like praying, did you do so? Okay? Where he is some sort of auxiliary and ta appears on the main verb that precedes it. Somewhat surprisingly, the question marker O also seems to act as an auxiliary in that when it is present in the sentence, the person marking appears before the question marker and not on the verb itself. That's shown in number 7. The last bit here is, do you accept him? Habosote cho. Okay, and here we're getting, I'll show in a second that te is a phonological variant of this ta suffix. Number 8 shows something similar for an auxiliary quoso, which also seems to be something like do. Okay. So let's move on to page 4. One of the points that I want to claim about this ta is that it links two verbs two clauses, when those clauses would have the same subject. That's true for all of the examples that we've seen so far. I did find one slightly interesting example where there is not strict identity between the subjects of the two clauses, but nevertheless ta is used. So here's a rather racy sentence in number 11.